Welcome to another episode of Judgment Day. I can't believe that a year and a half, if not more, into this pandemic, we are still debating these issues. And if you're like me, just a sort of humble lawyer who really doesn't know about virology and all the intricacies there are, forgive me, but I'm sure like me, you're very confused about the situation, which is why I'm always so grateful that there are a group of absolute top flight virologists and medical experts who prepare to come and talk to me about this in the view that they will educate all of us and try to, in a sense, dissipate the fog which has descended upon us. And the particular individual, Professor Francois from the Wits University, who really is an expert and is always extremely gracious of his time. Francois, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure to be here.
And can I just ask you, I mean, if we start with the third wave, how predictable was this? I mean, you know, there's a sense that, oh, we were all taken by surprise, and then effectively, therefore, you can't really blame us for not being quite as prepared as we should have been.
I think that there needs to be a little bit of forgiveness, and I think the scale of the third wave took many of us by surprise. It was fairly predictable we were going to get one. You know, the first and the second waves were so 6 monthly apart, and we've seen this with other viruses. So that forgiveness needs to be tempered. I was quite horrified 2 weeks ago to watch the Gauteng Premier proudly telling us that the worst case predictions were what they modeled, which means that they saw it coming. They just thought worst case prediction meant it wasn't going to happen. So I think that there were lots of modelers who actually did put this together as being one of the things that could have happened. What happened in Gauteng, sadly, is it doesn't seem like anybody made any attempt to prepare for this. And as the numbers have shot up here, and sadly are going up in the Western Cape and elsewhere, this province in particular has got nothing. You know, there should be very limited forgiveness for not predicting this. But also, just you asked about whether it was predictable. There were other countries where the 6 monthly cycle was being shown. So it wasn't fully predictable. This virus teaches a lot of humility, but they should have been prepared somewhat for something to come.
Now, the fact is, it's gone up astronomically in Gauteng, and one reads the positivity rates 28 to 30%. Does that mean that the rest of the country is going to be engulfed in exactly the same wave in a couple of weeks' time already?
So it's difficult because every single province has had a different pattern. So the Western Cape is an interesting province. Its second wave was much worse than its first wave, while Gauteng first and second wave were very similar. The third wave in Gauteng is eclipsing the first two by orders of magnitude. The Western Cape, as of yesterday, overtook its worst of the second wave. So some of the provinces are looking very grim. Some of the provinces are over their third wave by the looks of things, such as the Northern Cape. And then the Free State's having this bizarre double dip where it's suddenly starting to show an increase in numbers again. So, you know, again, the Gauteng situation is the most severe in the immediate next week or two, because it only looks as if it's only just peaked. But that peak is 3 times higher than the previous 2 waves. And now the Western Cape, as I said, is the scary trajectory that looks as if it's certainly going to be worse than the first than their second wave.
And so is there nothing in this situation? I'm also confused by this. The president 2 weeks ago announced the lockdown. Fine, I understood that, I suppose. Although I know that some people suggested that, you know, in a sense, the horse had bolted. But what I find confusing is, like last night, he opens up gyms and restaurants again. Now, either that was a mistake 2 weeks ago, or it's a mistake now. But you can't have it both ways. Or am I seeing something? Am I not seeing something I should be seeing?
It's perfectly put. It was exactly what I was raging on at my family yesterday. Is what's changed from 2 weeks ago? My personal view is that any indoor congregation since March last year is a really shocking idea. There are ways to make it much safer, but whatever held 2 weeks ago and meant that these should have been shut down would hold now. So as you say, it was either a mistake 2 weeks ago or which you're reversing now, and then you need to tell us why. But unfortunately, I think the one thing that changed some of my thinking around this third wave is just how bloody transmissible this virus is. This Delta variant is scary transmissible. You know, the kind of confidence I probably had at the last interview I gave you as to, you can make indoors safe, just open a few windows and open a few doors. That still holds, but I'm much less confident now that you are going to be totally safe if you just pay attention to that. The transmissibility of this virus is actually quite remarkable. There have been these case studies of people just that you might have seen this Australian case in the mall where somebody just brushed past somebody else. Now, initially, if that happened in South Africa, I'd say, well, they probably were infected elsewhere. But there's so few infections in Australia. They haven't documented that. It's very compelling that the traditional thing we went on about 2 meters and 15 minutes probably is a lot less with this particular variant.
But if you looked at that particular photograph, I mean, that little video, that means literally 30 seconds you could get the damn thing.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the scariness of it comes from, is that and I saw the NICD put out guidance reinforcing the 2 meters and 15 minutes, which is probably just, waiting for the scientists to get their heads around this one still. But you're right, 30 seconds brushing against each other, that might explain why the waves are so severe, is that the people that wouldn't have got it the first time around, people like me who probably brush against people for 30 seconds thinking, well, that was not much at the mall, would probably have got it this time around.
So, so on that particular basis, then, we've got so few people vaccinated. I mean, what's close to 4 million, I suppose. Does that mean, we'll leave the vaccinated people aside, does that mean we just simply have to ride this out?
Yes, sadly. And when we last had this interview, that was what I was speculating about, but I'm far more confident about that. We're all going to get this virus at some point. The only people are not are people sitting on an island somewhere who sit behind closed doors for the rest of their lives. And we're going to get it several times in all likelihood, like we do the other coronaviruses. It's that first time you get it that is so dangerous, and particularly if you're elderly or have comorbidities. But even if you're young, it's not without its consequences. I think the other thing since we last spoke that has been more apparent is long COVID is so much more severe and has so many protein manifestations in the body that scares me actually in some ways more so than the mortality and the morbidity associated with it. So the only way out of this mess is mass vaccination, and as quickly as possible.
Well, can I just ask you this? When you speak about the only way out of this is everybody getting COVID, does that mean either getting it or being vaccinated?
Yes, one of those two is the only way out of it. If you've got it, you get a huge amount of immunity. It's essentially a vaccination. It's a very, very, very dangerous vaccination, but it's a form of vaccination. And if you get a vaccination on top of that, it just super boosts your immune system. How long, we're not certain yet, but it's looking pretty good so far. In the same way as if you get 2 different kinds of vaccines, it seems to super boost you. And if you get the vaccine and then you get the COVID, which is second best, but not a bad second best, you kind of shrug it off, and it's a form of vaccination. But the problem I think people need to understand is like there's this misguided thing that is driven by, including senior scientists advising governments about herd immunity. This is not about herd immunity. This is about individual immunity. Everybody's going to get this, and all you've got to do is make sure that you get it vaccinated if at all possible.
So let me just ask you about the vaccines, and we'll come to the process in a moment. There's a hell of a lot of sort of misinformation about vaccines. Do we now have a better idea about what works with the Delta variant, for example? For example, I read that in Israel, they now were suggesting that the Pfizer only gives you 60-odd protection against mild and medium type of COVID, although over 90% in hospitalizations. Is that generally what will be happening here too?
It's happening across the globe. 20, and here at home, all my staff are vaccinated with the J&J vaccine. About 20% of them have had breakthrough infections. And this is what's going to happen to all of us. As I say, we're all going to get this virus. It's whether you get vaccinated or not, you're going to get a breakthrough infection. If you're vaccinated, it's just not going to put you in hospital. It's going to make you feel probably a bit, most of my staff, they were sick. They were person down for a day or two. One person was in bed for 2 days. It felt like a severe flu, she said. And she was vaccinated, but she bounced back. She's back at work a couple of days later, and she's in full form. So what the vaccine doesn't do is stop those breakthrough infections, which is what you're seeing in Israel and the UK at the moment, is massive surges of this Delta virus infection amongst people with vaccinations and unvaccinated people. The people who are dying, though, are the unvaccinated people. So I think people need to understand is that probably this is not what we call a sterilizing vaccine, where it stops all forms of infection. You're still going to get the thing. You may have a scratchy throat. You might be, if you're unlucky, be person down for a day or two. But in many ways, the third or the fourth time you get this virus, you're going to shrug it off and you're going to barely notice.
And do we? And you mentioned the idea of sort of two different vaccines. Is there some evidence now that if you have a J&J and a Pfizer, for example, one shot of the Pfizer plus a J&J or something of that kind, that it's giving you a more efficacious protection, or do we know anything about this now?
So this is not ready for prime time. So please don't go and grab Granny's vaccine for yourself in the meantime, because I really am worried that people are going to do this. There is lots of laboratory data to suggest that is if you mix what we call mix and match the vaccines, you get a more exuberant response. And it kind of makes sense, is that there's slight differences in where the immune system looks at the virus. So if it looks at two different places rather than just one, it's going to behave better. So this is really exciting stuff, because it means that if we find out these breakthrough vaccines are routine, we may be able to super protect people who are elderly or diabetic. They're not going to end up in hospital, but they might end up very, very ill. I don't take the flu vaccine to keep me out of hospital. I take the flu vaccine so I'm not sick for a week. We may need these booster vaccines for certain groups in the future, or perhaps for all of us. We just don't know yet. And the lab evidence is very, very reassuring that mixing and matching does the trick.
Now, let me ask you then, in relation to this, where are we then in terms, how hopefully that we're going to sort of vaccinate a significant proportion of the population by the end of the year? And let me ask two questions. Some people, for example, Professor Mardi said to me, and I'd be interested in your view, that he said, in order to get as many people vaccinated as possible, as quickly as possible, at least to give them protection against hospitalization and death, we should give almost everybody in the country, if we could, one Pfizer before we move on to the second. Would that help? And would that be better?
So a colleague of Shabir's, Jeremy Nell, who's amazing, said to me right as these vaccines were coming out, he said, speed is much more important than perfection when you have a wave after wave of this. And I had to think about that for a while, but he's completely right. And this would be the thing, is rather get some degree of immunity to as many people as possible. Now, the Pfizer vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna one, are both pretty amazing. They seem to set up some sort of immune reaction which grinds along for months after you've had the injection. That seems to steadily boost and boost and boost the longer you wait. So Shabir's right, I think, is that probably the best thing we should be doing is just herding everyone through the door and giving them one jab, and then as soon as we've kind of on top of everyone, get the second jab. I think the thing that worries me is that the group we really need to be focusing on, which is the group over the age of 60 and obviously those with comorbidities, we've only partially vaccinated a minority of them. We've been dropping the threshold and then congratulating ourselves for doing 200,000 vaccines a day, which is no mean feat. And honestly, there's some unsung heroes on the ground because of that. But what we should be asking is what percentage of those over 60s have had at least one shot? And to my mind, from what I look at it, it's far less than half. It's probably close to 20%.
Yeah,
in which case,
see, carry on. Yeah.
No, in which case, we haven't done our job properly. Those people are still at risk and are still going to overwhelm the health system.
So what I didn't understand, because if I recall correctly, when we started talking about this, both you and I and other virologists with whom I've spoken, experts, we were talking about a sort of population of about 6 or 7 million who were in that kind of 60 over, and obviously with the in addition to which there were comorbidity people. Now, since we've only vaccinated, close to 4, that figure sounds right to me, that we've only about 20-25%. Is it?
That's right.
Is there
No,
any
No, I agree with you. It doesn't make mathematical sense to me that we've made inroads into the big groups. And particularly as now that 4 million includes a lot of relatively healthy teachers and police officers and healthcare workers, that the group who really, really need this still are grossly under-vaccinated. And I think what worries me is when I look at the people around me who've been vaccinated, they're generally relatively wealthy, they're relatively connected, they're relatively urban. The people who've had knowledge, who've been able to register, who know how to use a cell phone registration system. Just as an anecdote, my domestic worker was trying to get registered. And I kept saying to her, here's the link. And she kept saying, I'm not getting my SMS. So then I grabbed her cell phone eventually. I got fed up and said, let me try and use the system. And her system, the formatting doesn't work on her phone. She's got a much older smartphone than I have. And she also said, what does this mean, next screen? And I suddenly realized I live and breathe laptops. Next screen is part of what I understand. She's much more used to, a much more the kind of SMS systems that are out there. So I think that what you're going to find is people with access to technology and people who are wealthy and have access to information are going to be grossly over-vaccinated at the moment, while poor people in the rural areas are going to be under-vaccinated.
Well, that's a shocking indictment. I mean, so how would you, could I ask you, how would you, if you were running the show now, how would you do it? And let me ask that question, sorry, to your best of your knowledge. I mean, is it now a question of distribution, or is it a question of supply, or is it a question of both?
I was listening to Mia Malone last night talking through the distribution and I think it's both. It does seem as if the delivery systems have been are not on target, but because we've been going so slowly, the pressure on the distributors, the pharma companies to give them to us has not been there. But we haven't got as many vaccines in the country as we should have. Having said that, the distribution networks are also just, as I said, this reliance on this EVDS system, which government seems to have embraced and certain people have embraced, which I just don't understand. We've never used this for our vaccination program. Our lessons from the HIV program is you have to remove every single impediment in the way. So I just think we should be using the private pharmacy networks, identifying critical ones around there and saying to everyone, please come. Have big tents at the taxi ranks and saying, we will jab you here. If you can just bring me a document, and this is the age threshold, just give us something that indicates to us that, say, for instance, the age threshold is 50. If you're above 50 and you want your vaccine, we're going to give it to you there and then. Try and make the system as simple as humanly possible. For the HIV program, we found that the minute you made people come back for a visit, they fell off the program. We lost 50% of people so initially we'd do an HIV test, then you'd come back for the result. In the old days, we'd lose 50% there. Then we'd do some sort of immunological markers to see if you're eligible for ARVs, we'd lose 50% again. And when I was watching people registering people from door to door in the old age, in the pension queue, I just, why don't you bloody well just vaccinate them there? You've got the opportunity. So I think that just trying to remove as many impediments as possible and find the old people, take the services to them, rather than passively saying, come to the hospital and we'll sort you out there.
So that really has intrigued me, because one of the issues, I mean, when you read about the South African experience, and the answer is, well, many countries in the world have struggled, indeed they have, there were a couple of things going for us. One was people like you, people had cut their teeth on the HIV pandemic and actually understood about viruses in a way that very few other countries did. So we had a cadre of experts. I'm not entirely sure that we've inspanned the best, but I'm not going to go there now. But the second thing was we also had this program of vaccines, I mean, across the board for children, etc. So what I don't understand is, given that, why have we made it so who's advising us to make it so complicated?
So I think one of the things that did worry me when I saw who was in charge of the rollout of the vaccines is, firstly, I don't want to give myself too much credit here, but one of the things I did say right at the start is people need to understand how hard it is that they're proposing. If we had to give every South African a glass of clean water tomorrow or in the next 6 months, we would have difficulty doing that, because the Department of Health it runs facilities. It doesn't have experience with running large-scale programs. The HIV program was very dependent on parallel NGOs and research units and policy units helping government to roll it out. And it took us it's been 18 years since we started, and we're still not quite up to speed. We were supposed to get the whole country up and vaccinated within 6 to 9 months. And I just didn't feel, when I was listening to the Department of Health people, the advisors, that they had the right people talking to them about what the scale of that was. There was very casual, we'll just give it in the current vaccine program. What they didn't recognize is that the current vaccine program is only focused on children, and it's focused on mothers bringing the kids in. Now you're focusing on adults, a much bigger population, many of them men who never go to health facilities. It's a recipe for disaster. So I think they underestimated how big a project this was actually going to be.
Where do we go from here? I mean, it's likely, presumably, we're going to get a fourth wave. It's not as if this is the last wave, I take it.
And no, I think there's a fourth wave coming, I'm afraid.
And would that be a different variant again?
Potentially, there is, the Delta variant is pretty effective as viruses go. It's hard to think how much more transmissible a virus could actually be. It's quite scary anticipating it. I thought the Beta variant, our second wave variant, was bad enough. This Lambda thing that's spreading through South America, though, is looking very infectious as well, but hasn't been found here or elsewhere. So it could be another variant. It could just be that we end up with 2 or 3 variants, the Lambda, the Beta, and the Delta circulating, and us getting it every 2 or 3 years. But I think the 4th wave's on the cards.
So if you write, we get a 4th wave towards the end of the year on your 6-month cycle, but give or take, I'm not going to hold you to it. So it means that eventually this wave dissipates, let's call it a month or 6 weeks, and it starts going down. I mean, that gives us some breathing room to get as many people vaccinated as possible. Now, I know you say 200,000 is good a day, and I'm not going to dispute that, but that's 1.4 million a week, sorry. And that means 14 million over 10 weeks. So if you're going to get a serious amount thing, that's probably 20 weeks away. That's bang in the middle of a 4th wave. So we're going to have to be really very efficient. I mean, are you hopeful that we're getting there?
I worry that 200,000 is already the people who are willing to stand through the snow and the sleet to get it. And that's what we saw with the HIV program. And in fact, it's been seen with the vaccine programs in other countries, including in the USA, where it's very easy to get to the first 20 or 30 because they'll take anything you give them. There's the opposite of vaccine hesitant, which is they have vaccine over enthusiastic, which is, just give me as many as you can. And I think I have a little bit in that group at the moment, having seen how good they are.
Trust me, I'm there. Yeah.
But the reality is that 200,000 is great, except to my eye, a lot of them are they're low risk, certainly for hospital. You're not vaccinating on the weekends, and you're also, slowing down as we go along, is a problem. So we probably should be heading for the 350,000 that the president's talking about.
Well, that's a hell of a challenge. I mean, but, it is more difficult, isn't it? I mean, to do this, I suppose, it's certainly more difficult in the middle of kind of anarchy in the country, for goodness sake, at the moment, but hopefully that'll pass. But it must be more difficult as well because in the middle of a wave, I mean, you don't want people all congregating, etc.
Yeah, and this was the sad thing, is that we should have been ahead of the curve. We can wring our hands about the AstraZeneca vaccines that got sent away, and I still am very sad about that because we would probably have 500,000.
Just on that, do you think we were wrong on that?
Totally wrong. We were wrong then, and we're even more wrong now. And I think
because it's pretty good for the Delta variant. Which is
it's shocking. Like, and the problem is that what I'm saying is that we said at the time, you're going to get breakthrough infections anyway. Stop wringing your hands about mild disease. Worry about hospitalization. And now, as you say, it's the best one against the Delta variant. And
could I just ask you just on that? Was the call at the time about the mild or moderate infections, was it? I mean, at that time, was AstraZeneca also dismissed because it wasn't efficacious against very serious, or was that not the case?
No, it was 100% effective against the very serious. It was, as they all are. I think that was why we were so frustrated. Is it was kind of looking a gift horse in the mouth, that's saying, oh, but it doesn't stop your sore throat or your 2 days in bed. Well, we were like, that's not why we're vaccinating people. We're vaccinating people to keep them out of hospital. We can pick up the pieces as to which is the best in terms of your sore throat or 2 days in bed. But for the moment, like, the crisis in the country is to try and get as many people protected as possible. So between that, the fact that I think the government was actually still very slow in procuring vaccines during the Sasonke trial, and very slow to get going. So all of those things, those factors together, meant that we essentially entered the 3rd wave unvaccinated. And I think there was a lot of excuse making, a lot of wishful thinking. I was listening to Nicholas Crisp talking about, he didn't think it was going to be very bad. I was listening, in May, Slim Karim was saying, he didn't think the Delta virus was something to really be that worried about because it didn't have, the specific mutations. And I'm not accusing them of, I think what I don't like is this certainty. It's almost a faith-based organization, which we're going to be okay, when patently, and that's what we're seeing in Gauteng, is the Gauteng government did not prepare for the worst case scenario because they thought worst case scenario meant it's not going to happen.
Yeah, so just going back to I'm just curious about this, partly because I think you learn from experience. The decision not to procure the AstraZeneca at the time, presumably, I mean, you can't blame government. They take advice, and that would have been from their ministerial advisory committee. They would have told them not to take it. I take it. That must have been.
I don't even know if that. So I would assume
okay.
so, but I do know that when I was on the ministerial advisory committee, government was making all sorts of decisions and saying the scientists have advised us when we hadn't even discussed it. So this is why I think there needs to be more and more pressure on them to release these advisories, is to say, what's the basis for this? It's not a question always of blaming. It's just sometimes just wanting to understand what the thinking was behind it.
Well,
but people
we
also
never
need to be
get proper
accountable.
press conference. We never get any kind of. I know. It's unbelievable. So let me ask you then one final question, because we're running out of time. Just in terms of treatment, I mean, again, this is from a position of complete ignorance, but when you guys were involved with the HIV, science eventually developed a set of antiretrovirals which wouldn't cure the virus, but would send people to live with it. And here, of course, we have got remarkably a vaccine that certainly has far more profound effects. But in the terms of treatment, are we where we were? Is there nothing further that people who get hospitalized can get than, let's say, they were getting 9 months ago or a year ago?
So there have been big steps forward for people who are hospitalized. The oxygenate, just knowing how to oxygenate them, when to stick in tubes into their throats and onto the various ventilators and things. People got much more conservative. So in fact, the mortality rates in countries where the numbers are, where things have been under control, have actually dropped quite remarkably when they've introduced steroids. There are a couple of other medications which are not quite as potent, but which have also been introduced. So there have been incremental benefits to going into hospital, whereby once you're in the hospital, there actually is a fairly large number of things to be offered, and a lot of stuff that's been learned in the last year. The frustration is before your hospitalization, there's diddly squat other than a distance peck on both cheeks and Panado and some aspirin and lots of fluids. It's probably the stuff we would have advised 60, 80 years ago for flu as well. So sadly, that's the frustration. That's why you're seeing some people are advocating all sorts of medications, and we've had the whole slew from chloroquine across to ivermectin and every other crackpot theory on the planet.
None of which, as I understand it, have been shown to work.
No, not a single one of them has been shown to work, despite all the very, very constant. And they're unlikely to work particularly well. We don't have potent antivirals in the acute respiratory viral period. And the particularly ivermectin, it's almost magical, the properties people are giving it, because the Tamiflu, which we use for the flu virus, which many people have heard of, cuts your symptoms by a few hours. It doesn't make you better overnight in the way that the ivermectin proponents say. So it's very, very unlikely that we're ever going to have a medication that's going to return you back to work tomorrow morning when you get COVID today. And unfortunately, we're seeing this with all these muties that are coming out, essentially. I get the frustration because we don't have anything to give somebody in that situation. That will change. There are I'm aware of about 60 different medications which are being tested, including by our group, to try and offer it. So when you lose your sense of taste, you take a 5-day course of antivirals, and hopefully you will be protected from those 2 days in the hospital, in bed, that I was talking about.
But going back to the hospital side, I just wanted to know, does that mean that part of the trick here is knowing when to get somebody to hospital?
Yes, and that is the sad reality I've been dealing with in the last 2 weeks here in Gauteng, is having both patients as well as people I know waiting for a hospital bed. And, we've managed to arrange hospital oxygen concentrators at home. I've been able to advise them on WhatsApp and on the phone. But not everyone has access to a couple of grand to pay for a hospital concentrator. We haven't been able to find actual oxygen cylinders for love or money in Gauteng because everybody's been using them. So patients are essentially sitting in chairs and on benches waiting for a bed while they're sitting on the oxygen masks, often for 2 to 3 days. So it's a dreadful situation. And this is why I get angry with the Gauteng government is, they shut down the whole of facilities which could have accommodated some of this, and started only to bring in healthcare staff almost at the peak of the first wave, of the third wave, when they should have been preparing for this months ago.
And to the best of your knowledge, are the other provinces doing better?
So I do know the Western Cape has been much more proactive. They seem to have a plan in place. We haven't seen the overriding of the other provinces in quite the same way, although sometimes the data systems from there aren't that great. The Eastern Cape has had a terrible experience with the first and the second wave, where it's been overwhelmed. The numbers there at the moment are still steadily going up, and we haven't had too many signs of distress other than the usual Eastern Cape Health Department distress. But yeah, it's a kind of a wait and see, and hopefully those lessons they learned the first and the second time around, we can apply successfully in the third round and not have the Gauteng experience.
I have a feeling, I've run out of time. I have a feeling I'm going to have you back again. This ain't going away in a hurry. That's the depressing part about it. Well, I suppose is at least the more optimistic note is that, I mean, science has done extraordinarily well in a very short space of time, and hopefully it'll continue to exponentially grow in that way. But Francois Venter, yet again, I'm indebted to you, as I'm sure my listeners are, my viewers, for giving us such a lucid account of what in some ways is a very depressing episode in which we could have done so much more, and hopefully we will as a future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody.